Under hard floodlights, a rope squealed through wet grit, and a dented metal lunchbox came up out of the dark like a memory that had been holding its breath. Mud sheeted off the sides, bright green and orange dinosaurs peeking through the slime. A gloved hand cracked the latch. Inside, everything was small and careful. A sandwich container, a strip of fruit leather, and a name scratched into tin by a child who thought it would last forever. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. The summer of '89 held on longer than it should have. Heat pressed low over the pastures, and the sky, a bleached kind of blue, looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. In Emery County, our days had a rhythm you could set your watch by a late morning wind coming across the fields, sprinklers clicking in backyard arcs, the AC units coughing to life right after lunch. That was the background noise of home, the ordinary I thought would run on forever. I was 15 that August, old enough to drive down the gravel road with strict instructions, and $5 folded in the console for gas if I needed it. Our house sat 1 mile off Farm to Market 1649, white siding, a sloped metal roof, a porch that always smelled faintly of cedar after rain. Dad kept a spare set of keys on a nail by the door and believed front locks were more for city people. Mom believed in porch lights and casseroles and the kind of talk that happened leaning against the hood of a hot car at dusk. Toby was 10 and growing into his legs, skinny fast a comet in a scuffed pair of sneakers. He'd leave a trail of pocket junk wherever he landed a pocket knife from Uncle Kenny, a marble the whistle from a Cracker Jack box he swore still worked. Frankie was 6 and tender, the kind who covered his ears for the evening train, because the horn felt too big for the world. He had a blue shirt with a frog button stitched at the hem that he used like a worry stone. My brothers moved through the house like weather, a noise you learned to read before it broke. Across the county road lived my Aunt Teresa, with her girls Sadie and the twins Janie and June. The Marsh place sat lower a little closer to the creek, where the ground stayed damp, and the cicadas sounded closer to the surface. Sadie was 9 and carried herself like an older sister to all of us, even me sometimes. She was the only kid I knew who would look a grown man in the eye and hold it until he looked away first. The twins finished each other's thoughts and traded shoes on purpose just to confuse us. You couldn't miss them when they ran 2 small blurs in mismatched socks laughing like they'd invented it. Sundays meant church and polite handshakes and a nap that never lasted long enough. Weeknights meant the grown-ups sitting under a box fan on our porch using the pickup's hood for a table. Paper plates, a jar of pickles, a bottle of orange soda sweating into a ring. Uncle Kenny would pull up around supper time and honk twice for no reason other than the sound. Mom would call "lift your feet" as she slid a mop through the kitchen, and Dad would stand at the open window and breathe like the air felt new. There was safety in repetition. In Emery County, the ordinary was a kind of promise. Hollow Creek State Park sat 12 miles out past the feed store and the water tower with the faded bobcat painted on the side. It wasn't fancy, a ribbon of asphalt that gave way to gravel, a patchwork of picnic tables set on crooked slabs, a shallow lake that glowed brown-green under afternoon sun. There was an old stone well in a field near a stand of oaks, not the kind you pull water from, just a ring of concrete and rock capped off sometime before I was born. Someone had painted "Keep Out" on the rim in white like a dare. We understood it was a relic, not a destination. The park rangers came by twice a week, 3, if the budget was kind. In late August, a blister of heat sat on us for so long it changed how sound moved. By noon, the cicadas weren't singing. They were screaming. The gravel in the driveway burned through the soles of cheap flip-flops. Even the farm dogs slept with their legs straight out, too hot to curl. It made people short of breath and short of patience and ready for a break. Labor Day weekend was the light at the end, one more cookout before school, one more run to the lake coolers loaded with ice and someone's best attempt at potato salad sliding around in the back of a truck. Mom was the one who said we should make a day of it. Hollow Creek's close shade by the bathrooms if you get there early. she told Teresa on the phone, rolling dough with a dust of flour on her palms. I remember the dry knock of the rolling pin, the little cloud rising in the kitchen light, her voice steady like it always was when she set a plan in motion. Teresa said she'd bring the red cooler and the twins' favorite pops. Uncle Kenny promised to handle the grill. Dad claimed the hamburger meat, which meant he'd be elbow-deep in a mixing bowl with a look like he was solving something that mattered. I wasn't excited so much as expectant. There are days you remember because something extraordinary happens. There are days you remember because nothing should have. On that Friday before the long weekend, I drove into town for ice and batteries, the kind that powered the cheap flashlight Mom kept in the glove box and the little pink digital watch Sadie liked because it beeped every hour. In the hardware store, the air felt cold and smelled like rubber hoses and fertilizer. I bought 2 packs of AAs and a roll of kite string for Frankie, who had decided a shoebox with a tail could fly if you ran hard enough. The clerk rang me up and tucked 2 peppermint discs in the bag like always. Those are the tiny mercies I catalog now, the way decency feels when it doesn't know it's being watched. That evening, the sky turned the color of peaches, and then went dull like someone scraped the shine off with a knife. Heat lightning stitched the far horizon, and the old pecan tree in our yard gave a single creak, like a door thinking about opening. After supper, Toby and Frankie begged me to time them racing to the mailbox and back. "No shoes," Frankie said, already hopping from foot to foot. I let them pretend to keep time, then lied, telling them they tied, which they celebrated as if it were victory squared. When they settled, the house held the kind of quiet you get only after a storm or a tantrum. The soft thrum of a refrigerator, the clock in the hallway, ticking from one room into another. I carried towels to the closet and found one of those small rips in the fabric of a day that you only notice later. On the shelf sat a metal lunchbox with a row of cartoon dinosaurs that had seen better years, green stegosauruses, a T-Rex done in bright orange. Toby had cleaned it up for the new school year himself, wiped each sticker until it shone. He'd scratched his initials inside the lid with a nail, careful and proud. The latch didn't sit quite right, and when I thumbed it closed, it popped back open with a click just enough to catch my attention. I pressed harder. It stayed. I didn't mention it to him. It felt like tempting fate to point out a fault to a kid who finally loved something that wasn't a baseball bat or a slingshot. Later, I stepped out on the porch and watched the road. The air tasted like it had been run through a hot hose. Across the way, Teresa's kitchen window lit up like a lantern, the twins moving past in fast flickers, 2 shadows in lockstep. Sadie's silhouette lingered in the doorway a second, then turned quick as a deer. A minute after, her porch light clicked twice their unspoken code that they were in for the night. Dad came out behind me and set his coffee on the rail. "You'll miss this when you're gone," he said, not looking at me. It wasn't a warning, it was a theory. I told him I wouldn't. That's the beautiful arrogance of 15. The first crack in the paint, and that's what it felt like, a hairline, arrived as a side comment. At the kitchen table, Mom circled the park on a county map with a pencil, the lead smudging where the road gave up and the gravel began. "They don't patrol as much on Sundays," she said, like she was telling herself not to forget. "Budget, they say." She didn't look worried. She looked practical. She added a handwritten list: charcoal lighter fluid, paper plates, the cheap kind that bend fork and tongs, mustard sliced onion in a jar, $5 cash for ice. Under it she wrote in small letters, "Watch the well." It was nothing. It was everything. Uncle Kenny stopped by late to drop off the grill grate he'd wire brushed to a shine. His truck sat in the yard, idling headlamps, throwing twin cones across the fence line. He thunked the grate against the porch and grinned in that tired way men grin when they've done something useful for the day. "I'll bring the horn," he said. He meant the pickup 2 honks that sent every child in our family running like it was a dinner bell signed by God. Dad laughed and told him not before noon. Mom told him bring more ice than he thought he needed. Kenny said sure, and then looked over my shoulder toward the road like he'd heard something I hadn't. When I turned, there was nothing there, just a bleached sky and a black wire stretched between poles over a field that needed rain. Inside, I set out the paper plates and stacked plastic cups in a neat pyramid that felt ceremonial. Frankie's frog shirt lay folded on a chair, back the button cool under my thumb. I laid out the sunscreen, the bug spray, the Band-Aids, the petty gear an older sister carries like a quiet badge. In the hall, Toby's sneakers slept with their toes touching, ready to go. There is tenderness in a house that's packed for tomorrow. It looks like order, but what it really is faith. Around 10, the back door eased in the frame like the heat had a hand on it. I checked the lock, even though Dad didn't believe in needing one. Habit is a powerful foundry. When I clicked the deadbolt, I noticed the porch thermometer stuck at 92 degrees even in the dark. The air tasted like metal, and the wind had gone missing. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled with no promise attached. The pecan branches barely moved. The yard light hummed. I went room to room, turning things off, the lamp in the den. The fan in the twins' old crib we used as a laundry catch the kitchen radio that never quite tuned to any station but kept a whisper going anyway. In the sink, the colander waited with sliced onions floating like pale moons. Mom made a list for church and tucked it under a magnet shaped like a pie. The crease in her forehead softened when she saw me watching. "We'll be out early," she said. "Shade goes fast." I nodded and tried to picture the picnic table. We'd take the one near the bathrooms close to the first stand of oaks 150 feet from the old stone ring. In my head, the map made sense. In my chest, something small adjusted itself and then went still. We almost never left laundry in the machine overnight, but that night we did. We almost never left the hose dribbling at the pecan's base, but that night we did. We almost never forgot to put the kite string back in the drawer, but that night it sat coiled on the counter like a promise I hadn't made and couldn't keep. None of it mattered. All of it matters. I stood at the window a minute more and looked at the road. It lay there like a ribbon left on a grave, pale and quiet, leading off toward the park. You could reach in 20 minutes if the lights were with you. A moth worked itself ragged against the screen. The clock in the hall ticked past the top of the hour and kept going, same as it had on every other night. The house held its breath and let it out again. When I finally turned off the porch light, I left the switch halfway down the bulb, still faint, not quite off a habit from storm seasons, when you want a little glow to find your footing if the wind changes. The last thing I heard before sleep was the soft thud of Uncle Kenny's tailgate as he closed it down the road, preparing for tomorrow. The last thing I saw was the lunchbox on the counter catching a sliver of streetlight, the latch holding the dinosaurs smiling like they always had. Morning would come. The sun would lay itself over the county like a hot hand, and we'd load the truck the way we always did. But that night ended with our porch light burning longer than usual and the phone sitting quiet on its hook. No ring, no warning, just a stillness so complete it felt like the world had stepped one slow inch to the left, and nobody noticed yet. Morning came, dressed in a haze of gold heat, the kind that makes even the cicadas sound tired. I woke to the smell of coffee and the soft thud of coolers being dragged across linoleum. Mom was already moving through the kitchen in that efficient, wordless rhythm she had when her mind was on the day ahead, bread to slice, towels to fold, bug spray to check. The truck keys sat on the counter beside a folded map of Hollow Creek State Park. On the back, I could still see her note from the night before in pencil, "Watch the well." At the time, it barely registered, one of those harmless parental warnings meant for little boys who liked to lean too far over things. It didn't feel like prophecy yet. Dad was loading the truck when I stepped outside. The air smelled of metal and charcoal. He had the tailgate down cooler packed tight, a stack of paper plates wedged beside the Coleman stove. Toby came running out with his dinosaur lunchbox clutched under his arm like a trophy. Frankie followed, shirt half-tucked, frog button flashing in the sun. They were loud, already circling the truck, arguing over who got the window seat. Mom told them to hush her voice, more gentle than stern. Teresa's station wagon turned into the drive a few minutes later, radio humming through the open windows. The twins pressed together in the back seat like bookends, and Sadie up front with her knees pulled to her chest. She waved at me through the windshield, that quick, sure motion she always had, the kind that looked like she knew exactly where she belonged in the world. We caravanned out of town after 9. The air shimmered above the road in waves, and the smell of cut grass drifted in from the fields. I remember the drive as a long, slow slide through light yellow, then white, then too bright to look at directly. When we turned off the main road, the pavement ended and the tires found gravel. Hollow Creek always felt a little removed from everything else, tucked behind low ridges of pine and a shallow lake that never seemed to decide if it wanted to dry up or not. The park had been losing its shine for years, but we didn't care. The grown-ups liked the quiet and the kids loved the freedom. We set up near the edge of the clearing, 2 tables under a stretch of oaks that still carried some green despite the heat. Mom laid out the tablecloth while Dad got the coals going. Uncle Kenny parked close enough for the tailgate to serve as extra seating. The air filled with the scent of charcoal and bug spray and those cheap burgers that burned fast and taste better because of it. Teresa opened her cooler, revealing a small miracle of preparation cans of Shasta buried in ice plastic bags of watermelon, the twins' favorite red pops already sweating in their wrappers. It felt like one of those rare days when every piece clicks into place without anyone trying too hard. By early afternoon, the kids had invented their own game, something about timing obstacle runs through the trees and counting who could make it back first. I remember hearing their laughter weaving through the woods, sharp, echoing, full of life. Sadie's voice was the loudest, directing the others like a small general. She was serious about rules even when they were made up 5 seconds earlier. Mom called after them not to go far, and they yelled back something half-heard and confident. We all relaxed again. The adults settled into that soft, mid-afternoon quiet that comes after the first round of food paper plates, sagging under half-eaten burgers, soda cans, sweating rings on the table. Kenny was telling a story about a broken carburetor, Dad pretending to listen while he scraped at the grill. I remember watching the smoke curl upward, thinking it looked like gray ribbon unspooling toward the sky. The heat rose off the ground in waves. A single cloud drifted across the sun, and for a moment, everything dimmed, the kind of shade that makes you breathe easier without realizing it. I can still see Teresa leaning back in her folding chair, a paper plate balanced on her knees, calling out, "Give them another 10 minutes." Her voice carried that lazy faith adults had in the safety of familiar places. The park wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It was where we learned to ride bikes, to swim, to make a fire without scorching our hands. Even the old well was more myth than menace. Kids dared each other to look over the edge, not fall in. When the sun shifted again, I noticed how quiet the woods had gone. No laughter, no footsteps, not even the whip of branches from a running child. Just the steady drone of cicadas. I glanced at Mom, but she didn't look up. She was peeling the wrapper off a bar of chocolate, focused on stacking graham crackers for the kids' s'mores later. I thought maybe they'd gone farther along the trail chasing frogs near the stream. It wasn't strange enough to sound an alarm. Not yet. The burgers were done before the kids came back. Dad lined them up on a plate grease pooling under the patties. "Go get the pack," he said half to himself. Mom looked toward the trees. They heard the horn. But when Uncle Kenny honked twice, the signal that never failed to bring them running, nothing moved. Just the echo sliding down the hill and dying in the brush. I saw the first flicker of concern cross Mom's face, quick and small, the way a candle shifts when the air changes. She called again, louder. No answer. Teresa stood up, brushing crumbs from her shorts, shading her eyes toward the tree line. "Sadie," she called. Still nothing. The stillness deepened until it felt heavy, the kind that presses down on your lungs. Dad set his spatula down and wiped his hands on a towel. "I'll go check the loop," he said like it was routine. No panic yet. He disappeared into the trees with his hat pulled low, his voice fading as he called their names one by one. I remember the time between his leaving and his return more than his face when he came back. It was a long stretch of waiting, punctuated by the hiss of the grill and the steady beat of someone's heart mine, maybe Mom's, maybe the world's. When Dad reappeared, he looked different, pale lips tight. "They're not out there," he said quietly, glancing toward the lake, as if saying it too loud would make it true. I checked the stream, the old trail, even by the fire ring. Nothing. Teresa's soda spilled out of her hand, hitting the ground with a sound that seemed too loud for daylight. "Don't," Mom said, reaching for her. "They'll turn up." But her voice cracked on the last word. Kenny started his truck and drove the perimeter road twice, horn blaring at every turn. I remember the sound bouncing off the trees, rolling back empty. I walked down to the edge of the clearing to where the grass gave way to dirt and roots. The air there felt different, cooler, but wrong. The well sat maybe 50 yards away, just visible through the brush, a dark mouth ringed in stone. I didn't go closer, just stood there, squinting into the shade until my eyes adjusted. A bird lifted from the rim wings, snapping against the silence. When the men came back, the light had already started to tilt toward evening. Dad's shirt clung to him with sweat. Mom kept asking what time it was, but no one answered. The sky turned the color of copper and shadows reached long across the ground. Someone suggested the kids might have wandered toward the parking lot, maybe gone looking for the restrooms. The words sounded too practical, too hopeful, but they gave us motion again. By the time the first deputy arrived, the picnic site looked like an abandoned fairground, plates scattered, the cooler half open, the air thick with the smell of ash and spoiled heat. Flashlights cut across the clearing in thin white arcs. I remember the sound of radio static, the muffled voices, the bark of a dog somewhere deeper in the woods. A ranger asked Mom for a description, and she said their names one by one, her voice getting smaller each time. I stood near the well when they checked it the first time. They dropped a light down on a rope, just a faint glow disappearing into the dark. The ranger called up that it looked clear water glinting at the bottom. No one wanted to believe otherwise. They moved on to the trails, to the lake, to the picnic areas we never used. Hours passed like minutes, minutes like days. Every time someone shouted a name, the woods answered with nothing but echo. I remember the smell of wet leaves when the night air finally cooled, the way it mixed with diesel from the search trucks. I remember Teresa sitting on the tailgate wrapped in a blanket, rocking back and forth without sound. Kenny stared at the well as if trying to solve a riddle carved in stone. Mom stood beside him, arms crossed tight, eyes fixed on the tree line. She kept whispering, "They know their way back." But even then, I think part of her already understood they wouldn't be walking out. Around midnight, floodlights turned the clearing into a white stage. The search dogs returned, noses low, tails uncertain. Nothing. I watched the park come apart in quiet, orderly desperation, lines of flashlights moving through the dark radio chatter, climbing and falling, the hum of generators filling every gap in conversation. No one talked about going home. No one said the word lost out loud. Sometime after 2, a deputy asked if anyone had something of the children's for scent. Mom handed him Frankie's frog shirt from the back of the truck. I remember how small it looked in his hands, the button shining faintly under the lights. He folded it carefully like an apology. Then the dogs were gone again, swallowed by the woods. The wind picked up near dawn, stirring the ashes in the cold grill and scattering paper napkins across the ground. The smell of rain rode in behind it, that earthy scent that means change is coming, whether you want it or not. I sat on the truck step, watching the horizon pale from black to blue-gray. Somewhere behind me, an officer said they'd have to pause the search once the storm hit. Mom didn't respond. She was still staring toward the well, her hands clasped so tight the knuckles had gone white. The first drops fell just as the sun broke through the clouds, fat and warm, dotting the dust until it turned to mud. We stood there in it, barely moving, not talking, still hoping to hear laughter echo from the trees like it always had. But all that came back was rain tapping on metal, the soft groan of thunder rolling through the valley, and the faint hollow sound of water dripping somewhere deep below the earth. That's how the search began. But that morning, those hours before everything was labeled a crime scene, was the last time Hollow Creek ever felt like a place you could come back from. We didn't know yet what the next 36 years would uncover. All we knew then was that the world had gone suddenly impossibly quiet, and that the sound of a single tricycle wheel turning in the wind could stop a heart cold. They called the second day of the search Containment Day. It meant the park was no longer open ground. It was a grid of numbered sections, each one marked by ribbons and caution tape, each one combed by strangers in uniforms. To me, it just looked like the place we'd picnicked was dissolving. The tables stood empty, paper plates turned to pulp by rain, and the smell of wet charcoal clung to everything. My parents barely spoke. Mom sat under the ranger pavilion with her hands locked together, whispering the same prayer until her voice cracked. Dad moved through the crowd of deputies like he'd joined them, eyes sharp, searching even when there was nothing left to search. I remember the low rumble of diesel engines, the chop of helicopter blades pushing air down through the trees, and the way that sound carried miles beyond the park, through neighborhoods, over barns and backyards, announcing that 5 children were gone, and no one knew how. That night, the story made the local news. The camera caught my father's face in the background, white shirt soaked through, standing by the well. You could hear the reporter talking about theories, a possible animal attack, a sinkhole, maybe a stranger passing through. But none of that made sense. You don't lose 5 children in daylight with no footprints, no torn fabric, not a single shout for help. Even at 15, I knew that. You can tell when a story has holes. By the 3rd day, state police had arrived. Their trucks lined the dirt road leading into Hollow Creek blue lights, cutting through the fog that had settled overnight. They drained the well again, dropped lights and cameras, even sent in a diver after the water fell to its lowest level. Nothing. The bottom was slick with mud and old metal beer cans, a hubcap, the things people throw when they want to pretend they've left something behind. The searchers found nothing else. The park was closed by order that afternoon. What remained was handed over to detectives from Emery County, men who looked like they'd seen too many families crumble on too little sleep. The next weeks blurred into a rotation of searches and vigils. Our church filled with casseroles, nobody ate, people speaking softly in hallways, offering the kind of comfort that expires before morning. A command post went up inside the ranger station, and flyers appeared in every diner window, every post office, every gas station between here and Dallas. 5 smiling faces. I can still see them lined in a row. Toby's grin just a little forced, because he hated standing still. Frankie's eyes half closed, the Marsh girl's curls matching like they always did, and Sadie in the middle, chin lifted just enough to look brave. The paper color faded within a month. By winter, the wind had stripped most of them down to blank squares. Dad never stopped going back out there. He'd drive the county roads with a flashlight and a thermos check old hunting cabins, walk through creek beds until his boots split at the seams. Mom wouldn't let him go alone, so Uncle Kenny started taking turns, and together they combed the same ground until they could have mapped it blindfolded. They said the dogs picked up scent near the gulch once, but the trail vanished before it reached the main road. I remember watching the deputy try to explain that sometimes scent just stops wind-rain time. Mom looked at him like she was staring at a wall, nodding as if politeness might build a bridge back to her children. The official investigation slowed after a year. Leads dried up, funding pulled back. The case file grew thick with witness statements that said nothing fishermen who thought they'd heard kids laughing that afternoon Campers who'd noticed a brown pickup near the service road, a teenager who swore he saw a man in overalls by the trailhead, but couldn't describe his face. None of it held. The park was locked by chain across the gate by the fall of 1991, closed for restoration, the sign said. Everyone knew it wasn't the trees they were trying to protect. I left home for college a few years later, but Hollow Creek never left me. Every time I came back, I drove past that chained entrance, weeds growing up through the gravel, and felt the same cold hollow behind my ribs. Mom kept the house like a shrine, rooms untouched, clothes folded in drawers, school books stacked beside beds that would never be slept in again. She joined a group for missing children's families and learned the vocabulary of lost cold case evidence log ongoing review. Words that pretend progress exists. When I turned 45, I went back to Emery County for work. I'd taken a job with the clerk's office, records, land deeds, court transcripts. It wasn't passion, but it kept me close. Every so often I'd pull the old file, case 89-157, and read through the pages, trying to feel something new. I never did. Until August 2025. That was the summer a drone pilot found the tricycle. I remember hearing about it before anyone called. It was a Monday morning, late enough for the heat to already feel heavy. A coworker was scrolling through her phone at the desk next to mine. "You see this?" she asked, turning the screen toward me. The headline read, "Possible Break in Hollow Creek Disappearance." The photo showed a concrete ring swallowed by weeds, and inside it, just visible through the shadow, the curve of a red metal frame. My stomach went cold. It wasn't disbelief. It was recognition, the way you know a song from the first note, even if it's been decades. That afternoon, an investigator from the state police came by the courthouse asking about property records. Her name was Detective Sarah Mendoza. I told her who I was before she asked. She paused the way people do when the name catches up with the face and said quietly, "I'm sorry." I'd heard those words enough times to know they were placeholders for things nobody could fix. Still, I offered to help. She accepted, maybe out of courtesy, maybe because she sensed what this place had already taken from me. The next morning, I stood at the edge of that clearing again. 36 years had turned the park into ruined picnic tables collapsing under vines, barbecue pits rusted through tree roots pushing up the asphalt path. The well sat just as I remembered it, though smaller now, sunken deeper into the ground, its stones slick with moss. Floodlights had been rigged around it, powered by a generator that hummed like a distant heartbeat. Crime scene tape rippled in the heat. A tech in coveralls worked the camera cable down into the darkness, his face lit by the monitor's glow. Mendoza stood beside me, arms crossed, eyes narrowed against the glare. She didn't speak until the first image appeared. The tricycle half buried in mud, its paint bleached to orange. Then the shape beside it. The kind of shape you recognize without wanting to. "That's a hand," she said low, not for the record, but for herself. The air around us seemed to still. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a crow called once and went quiet. They pulled the first items up over the next day. The tricycle, a lunchbox, a small shoe with a rainbow charm still hanging from the lace. Everything came up caked in decades of earth, every surface the color of wet rust. Mendoza cataloged each piece as if she were collecting ghosts, careful not to break the spell of discovery. When they found the lunchbox, I knew before she said it that it was Toby's. I could see the faint outline of dinosaurs under the grime. She opened it carefully with gloved hands. Inside was a plastic container still holding the outline of a sandwich, and beneath the lid, scratched in a child's handwriting, the initials TG. By then, the sight had drawn attention. News vans parked along the road, drones buzzing overhead, reporters standing just beyond the tape. They called it a breakthrough in one of Texas's oldest unsolved cases. For us, it wasn't a headline. It was the day our waiting ended, and something colder began. Mom came out once, walking slow with her cane, her hair silver now, but her eyes sharp as ever. When she reached the tape, she just stood there looking at the well. They said it was empty, she murmured. Mendoza started to answer, but Mom cut her off gently. Don't apologize. Just finish what they didn't. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, every sound too deliberate. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the folder Mendoza had left with me, copies of the new evidence tags, photos from the excavation. In one of them, the camera caught something I hadn't noticed at the site, a faint square of fabric behind the tricycle patterned with tiny hearts. I remembered the twins wearing matching dresses that day, pink with white hearts. My breath caught before I could stop it. I didn't cry. The years had built something harder than that inside me. By morning, more items surfaced, a hair bow, a metal whistle, a faded Polaroid sealed in plastic. Mendoza stopped by the courthouse around noon. Her clothes smelled faintly of soil and rain. We found photographs, she said. I could tell she didn't want to describe them, but she did anyway. The children were standing in the woods facing the camera. Eyes wide expressions caught between fear and obedience, and behind them a tall figure half hidden by trees. We're working to identify him, she said. I nodded, but the image had already settled in my mind, sharper than any photo. That evening, the park was closed off completely, declared an active crime scene again after more than 3 decades. They said they'd keep digging until they reached bedrock. From the road, I watched the floodlights flicker through the trees, and for a moment it looked like the forest itself was breathing. Reporters talked about closure. I didn't believe in that word anymore. Closure implies you can turn a key and walk away, but grief like ours isn't a door. It's a well dark, deep, and patient. The next morning, Mendoza called me out to the site again. She didn't explain why over the phone, just said, "You'll want to be here for this." When I arrived, the crews were silent, gathered around the edge. The air smelled of wet clay and diesel. Something metallic sat on a folding table under a tarp. She lifted the corner, revealing a row of Polaroids, cleaned and laid flat under plastic. The children, again, same clearing, same background, and in one, Sadie's mouth open mid-scream. Behind her, the man's outline was clearer this time. He was holding something long and narrow in his hand, a pipe maybe, or a tool. Mendoza looked at me carefully. "We're cross-referencing park staff from that year," she said. "There's a chance he wasn't a stranger." Her tone was steady, but her eyes gave her away. I asked what she meant. She hesitated before answering. Someone who knew the park well enough to hide them where no one would look again. I felt the ground shift beneath that sentence. It wasn't what she said, it was how certain she sounded. When I left that night, the sky over Hollow Creek was the color of ash. The generators still hummed, but the air felt different, charged with something old rising back into light. As I turned onto the county road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the trees, I could see the faint gleam of those floodlights against stone. It struck me then, after all those years of silence, the park wasn't keeping its secrets anymore. It was giving them back one handful of earth at a time. And somewhere under that ground, deeper than the roots, lay the rest of what we had lost waiting to be found. It was past midnight when I realized Mendoza hadn't left the park in 2 days. I drove out there myself, headlights sweeping over gravel and weeds until the outline of her truck appeared. The air smelled of wet pine and diesel, that mix that clings to your clothes when work stops being about the clock. She was standing by the excavation pit, sleeves rolled, hands on her hips, staring down into the light like she was waiting for the earth to speak. She didn't turn when I called her name, just said, "We found something else," and pointed to a box sealed in plastic. It was a child's notebook, thin, spiral-bound, the kind they used to hand out at school orientation with a cartoon horse on the cover. The pages had stuck together from moisture edges gone brown. Mendoza looked at me, her voice low. "It's hers," she said. I knew which her she meant before she said the name. Sadie. The handwriting was still visible, careful, deliberate, the kind of printing you learn when you want adults to take you seriously. The first line stopped me cold. "My name is Sadie Marsh. I'm 11. He took us on the last day of summer. My knees nearly gave out right there." After 36 years of silence, she was speaking again. Mendoza closed the folder gently, like she was afraid of breaking something fragile, and asked if I wanted to step away. I shook my head. "Keep going." The next pages were short bursts of words, sometimes just fragments, what they ate, how long they'd been kept, what she saw when the others stopped talking. Her sentences got smaller toward the end, written like she was conserving space or time. She wrote about the sound of footsteps above them, the smell of oil and smoke, the way the light would flicker when the generator started. And then, one final line underlined twice, "I hid the gun. If I don't make it, tell my mom I tried." That line changed everything. It turned the story from loss to resistance. She hadn't been a victim lying down. She'd fought back. Mendoza ordered the area widened by 20 feet in every direction, tracing where the soil had shifted unnaturally. 2 days later, the metal detector hit. They found the revolver buried under a flat stone wrapped in cloth. The barrel was rusted shut, but the grip was intact, and so was the smear of dried blood near the trigger guard. The forensics team worked in silence. No chatter, no speculation, just the quiet acknowledgement that the ground was giving up what little it still owed us. When the DNA results came back, the blood on that weapon wasn't from any of the children. It belonged to a man named Calvin Durrell. The name didn't ring a bell until Mendoza pulled up the old Ranger logs from the late 80s. He'd been a seasonal higher maintenance crew gate duty, a few citations for trespass warnings he'd written himself. He was listed as transferred in 1990, which was a polite way of saying fired without paperwork. They ran his Social Security number. It was still active, tied to a series of temporary addresses scattered across Texas, then gone. No death certificate, no obituary, no tax trail after 1991. The kind of disappearance that only happens when someone wants to stay untraceable. The discovery put the entire county back on alert. Media vans came again, same as before, except now the reporters had something new to chase. They wanted a villain, a name with a face, and a quote they could play under the evening news logo. Mendoza refused every interview. "Let the evidence talk first," she told them. I sat beside her in the field office one evening while she reviewed old crime scene photos under a desk lamp. Her eyes looked older than they had 2 weeks earlier. "He didn't work alone," she said quietly, flipping through images of boot prints, tool marks, and remnants of rope recovered near the pit. "You don't control 5 children by yourself without noise, without someone noticing. He had help. Maybe someone who could keep things quiet." That thought landed like a stone in my chest. Hollow Creek was county land maintained by people we knew, inspected by rangers who lived down the road. It meant someone familiar with those woods could have been part of it. That realization sank deeper than anger. It was betrayal stitched into the soil we grew up on. A week later, the call came from Montana. A retired librarian in a small town outside Butte had seen the composite sketch on a news site. She said a man matching Durrell's description had rented a cabin behind her property 15 years ago under the name Clark. She remembered him because he never used lights at night and paid in cash. The local sheriff's office passed the lead to the FBI, and within 48 hours, they'd confirmed a match through an old fingerprint record. When they arrested him, he didn't resist. He looked older than I expected. Gray stubble, thin frame eyes that seemed to fade in and out of focus. When they asked about the children, he said, "You can't dig up ghosts," and then smiled like the words amused him. Mendoza called me that night. Her voice carried the exhaustion of years compressed into one sentence. "We got him." I didn't celebrate. I just sat there in the dark kitchen phone pressed to my ear, hearing the echo of rain against the windows. After she hung up, I went to my mother's house. She was sitting in the same chair she'd sat in the night they vanished, a blanket around her shoulders, even though it was warm. When I told her the name, she didn't react at first. Then she whispered, "He was the one who told me they were checking the South Trail that day." I felt my stomach twist. "You met him?" She nodded slowly. "He was wearing a ranger badge, said he'd make sure they stayed safe. The kind of sentence that breaks something you didn't realize could still break." In the weeks that followed, investigators pulled apart Durrell's past. His personnel file had been altered, pages missing, disciplinary notes blacked out. Beneath his name were references to an unregistered partner, an older man known to trade labor for lodging near the park boundary. His name was Eldon Hasker. They found what was left of his cabin after a wildfire years earlier, but neighbors remembered them together. Two men who kept to themselves rarely came into town except to buy canned food and ammunition. When the FBI searched the Montana property, they found a wooden trunk buried under the cabin floor. Inside were dozens of Polaroids, children in different settings, some wooded, some indoors, their faces frozen in fear or confusion. And tucked in the bottom, a row of 5 hash marks carved into the wood. It wasn't proof by itself, but paired with Sadie's notebook and the revolver, it became undeniable. They built the timeline backward. Durrell took the cousins one at a time, used the cabin as a holding place, then forced them into the old maintenance tunnel that connected to the sealed well. Sadie's final entries described the nights growing quieter, the others not waking up, and her finding the gun. The next part was hard to hear. Forensics showed Durrell's blood type matched the stain on the weapon, but there was no exit wound on his body when they found him, meaning she'd shot and injured him, but he'd survived. She must have thought he died. It explained the blood trail leading to the tree line that no one had recognized back in '89. It wasn't animal, it was his. Somehow, he'd buried the evidence, sealed the well, and walked away. Mendoza asked if I wanted to be in the room when they took his statement. I said yes. The FBI conducted the interview in Helena. The conference room was small, the air too cold, humming with fluorescent light. Durrell sat at the end of the table in shackles, staring at his own hands. He looked smaller than his crimes, like time had already punished him. When Mendoza slid the photo of Sadie's notebook across the table, he blinked once and said, "That girl wasn't supposed to fight." His voice was thin, papery. "She took the wrong thing from me." I wanted to speak to ask what that meant, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't elaborate. He just leaned back, eyes glassy, and whispered, "She got away." The room went still. Mendoza froze, mid-note, her pen hovering above the paper. "What do you mean she got away?" He smiled faintly. "You'll see. Some ghosts don't stay put." They ended the interview after that. He was charged with 5 counts of murder and transported under federal custody. He wouldn't stand trial long enough to face sentencing. He suffered a stroke 2 months later and died in a hospital bed under guard. The official record says the case closed with his death. But for those of us who lived through it, it didn't close anything. It just rearranged the silence. A few weeks later, while packing evidence for transfer, one of Mendoza's team found a small envelope tucked into the notebook's binding. Inside was a photograph, a strip of a photo booth, reel, 3 frames, all the same girl. Sadie. Older, thinner hair cut short. The film stock dated weeks after the disappearance. The background read Pine View Arcade, a place 3 counties north that had closed in 1990. Nobody could explain it. I stared at that photo for a long time, studying the details. The faint bruise near her temple. The half-smile that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite relief. It didn't make sense. If she'd survived even for a short time, where had she gone? And why hadn't anyone found her? Mendoza promised to run it through databases, facial recognition, missing foster records. But deep down, I knew she might not find anything. That night before leaving the station, she handed me the photo. She left it for someone to find, she said. Maybe she wanted it to end with you. I tucked it into my jacket pocket and walked out into the cold Montana air. The wind smelled of pine and snowmelt sharp enough to sting. Somewhere behind the ridgeline, the last light was fading, and for the first time in decades, I thought I saw the smallest shape of hope, not the bright kind that heals, but the quiet kind that haunts. When I drove home, I rolled down the window and let the wind fill the car. I didn't know what to do with that picture. It sat on the passenger seat, sliding with each turn, the way a heartbeat might move through memory. The highway stretched ahead, empty and pale under the moon, and for a second I imagined I wasn't alone, that somewhere out there Sadie was driving. Too older, now still keeping her promise, still making sure the truth didn't stay buried. That's where the story should have ended. But it didn't. Because a week later a letter arrived at my office with no return address, postmarked from New Mexico. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was uneven but unmistakable. It read, "Tell my mom I made it out. The well's open now. They'll remember." And beneath it, the same initials I'd seen carved inside a child's lunchbox, SM. The envelope stayed on my desk for 2 days before I could bring myself to open it again. It didn't feel like something sent through the mail. It felt like a message that had found its way through time. The postmark was faint smudged by handling, but the ink of her initials was steady, almost defiant. SM. I turned it over again and again, half expecting it to vanish if I looked away. The paper smelled faintly of smoke and old cedar. There were no fingerprints on the envelope except mine. Mendoza took it for processing anyway, knowing we wouldn't find much. When she handed it back the next morning, she said quietly, "Whoever sent this wanted it to reach you, not us." I think she was right. The next few weeks moved strangely, like the air had thickened. The discovery had gone national. Every network wanted interviews, retrospectives, survivor speculation segments, but none of that felt real to me. I was living inside a smaller world, one built from paper and memory. Every night I unfolded that note on my kitchen table and studied the letters, tracing the loops and angles. The handwriting was older than the notebooks, but not by much. Still feminine, still careful, but with the kind of tremor that comes from someone teaching themselves how to write again after years of silence. The words, "The well's open now," sat on the page like an invitation or a warning. Mendoza thought it might be symbolic, a message from someone trying to comfort the families, maybe an old volunteer, someone who'd followed the case for years. She wanted to believe that. I didn't. There was something about the phrasing that didn't read like kindness. It read like presence. I'd spent my whole life surrounded by people who spoke about closure as if it were a thing you could sign for and carry home. That letter proved closure isn't an ending. It's a door left ajar. We had the funeral that fall. They buried what remained of the 5, what could be identified, what time had allowed us to retrieve under one broad oak near the original clearing. The park had been reopened just for the day, cleared of tape and generators. Someone from the state brought in folding chairs and a podium, but no one spoke from it. The family sat in silence as the pastor read from a Bible warped by humidity. Mom held my hand the whole time, her grip strong, even though she barely weighed 100 pounds now. When they said the names Toby, Frankie, Janie, June, Sadie, her shoulders shook, but she didn't cry. I realized she'd run out of tears long before that morning. When the service ended, people lingered in small clusters, talking softly, avoiding eye contact. I walked to the well. It had been cleaned, reinforced with metal railings, and fenced off with a plaque installed beside it, in memory of the Hollow Creek 5, lost but never forgotten. Someone had left flowers tied with ribbon along the edge. I stared at that opening until the wind picked up, and I thought I heard something below it. Maybe water shifting, maybe the echo of leaves, or maybe something else. For a heartbeat, it sounded like a breath. Afterward, I drove Mom home. She sat quiet in the passenger seat, one hand resting on her lap. thumb brushing a folded handkerchief. As we turned onto our road, she said, "I knew she'd find a way." I asked who she meant, though I already knew. "Sadie," she said. "She was the only one who ever told me to stop worrying. Said if anything ever happened, she'd handle it herself." Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. I think she did. 2 days later, Mendoza called. "You might want to see this," she said. I drove back to the ranger station, expecting more paperwork or another media request to decline. Instead, she handed me an evidence bag containing a photograph. It had been left at the Emery County Sheriff's front door with no note, just a small yellow sticky tag marked, "For them." The photo showed the well again, but not as it looked now. The lighting was recent early morning, judging by the angle. There were no flowers, no ribbon, just the open mouth of stone, the shadows beneath it. On the back of the photo, in the same careful handwriting, was a single sentence: "No one else ends up down there." We ran every possible trace. No fingerprints, no camera, metadata, no source. The film was standard print stock, same brand you can buy anywhere. The photo had been developed professionally, though clean edges balanced light. Whoever took it wasn't careless. They were sending a message. I asked Mendoza if it could be a copycat, someone trying to keep the story alive. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, she said, "Or it's her keeping a promise." That night, I drove to the park again. The gates were locked, but I knew a way through the service road. The trees looked smaller somehow, or maybe I'd grown past them. The air was cool for September, carrying that dry sweetness that comes just before fall settles in. When I reached the clearing, the moon was high enough to light everything silver. The plaque glinted. I stood there, hands in my pockets, listening. The well's new railing felt cold under my palm. The wind rustled through the oaks like water moving underground. For a long while, I just stood still. Then faintly from somewhere beyond the trees, I heard it a soft, clicking sound like metal brushing stone. It stopped as soon as I noticed it. I waited, but the woods fell quiet again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe not. But as I turned to leave, something caught the light near the fence post. A Polaroid pinned under a small rock. I knelt down and lifted it carefully. It showed the same clearing, same moonlight, same angle, but I wasn't in it. Someone else had been there moments before me, standing where I stood facing the well, and at the bottom, scrawled in pen, was a familiar line. She stayed quiet. Then she spoke, and someone listened. I don't know how long I stayed there, but by the time I got back to my truck, the horizon was paling. I drove home on autopilot, the road, empty sky turning pink over the fields. When I reached the house, Mom's porch light was still on. She'd started leaving it that way every night, again, the same habit she had all those years ago. I didn't wake her. I just sat on the steps until the first sun broke over the treetops. There was a stillness to that morning that I hadn't felt in decades. Not peace exactly, but something close to understanding. In the months that followed, life tried to resume its shape. The park was sealed permanently, the land transferred to the state as a memorial site. They left the well open, though, by request of the families. Not accessible, just visible, a reminder. Mendoza was promoted to a regional task force, and before she left, she came by my office one last time. I think about her more than the others she admitted. The courage it takes to stay alive long enough to make sure the truth gets told. She paused. If she's out there, she's probably been living quietly all this time. But that letter... She shook her head. That was goodbye, wasn't it? I didn't answer. Sometimes at night I'll still hear the echo of her voice in my head, the tone from those pages, that unshakable resolve between the lines. Tell my mom I tried. It wasn't written as a farewell. It was a promise that she'd finish what they couldn't. Maybe she did. Maybe she still is. The day they installed the permanent plaque, I went alone. The sun was setting behind the ridge, casting the clearing in gold. I laid a single photograph at the base, the one of her from the photo booth strip, the faint smile, the short hair. Then I stepped back and looked at the inscription carved into the stone. She stayed quiet. Then she spoke. and someone listened. As I turned to leave, a wind moved through the trees, gentle but deliberate, bending the grass, carrying that faint scent of cedar and rain. I looked back once more at the well open and still reflecting the sky. In that moment, I understood that the story wasn't about what was taken. It was about what refused to die. That's what remains now, the echo. Not the tragedy, not the horror, but the voice of a girl who refused to be silenced, who wrote her way out of the dark and into memory. And every time I hear the wind slide through those trees, I think maybe that's her reminding us she kept her word. The well's open, we remember, and that's all she ever wanted.